Welcome. You are our quietest crowd ever. Amazing. It must be end of the year, but we have lots of explosive stuff here for you. So hopefully we have a heated discussion with Luke, trying to prove him wrong with his title, Why Would Paris Fail? Thank you very much for coming. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, the elders past and present. It's a pleasure to have you here for our last seminar of the year. We have exciting seminars, I'm sure, in the next year also lined up, but we want to end this year with a little bit of a touche, a little bit of a spark. And so Luke came out here. Luke was here last year already. We had Jonathan Pickering also from Canberra here, and they are the two in Australia debating on the Paris Agreement and also on the Trump effect of how useful it is or not that Trump is such a pain for the rest of the world, and what will be the response of to the Paris Agreement. Will the Paris Agreement falter or not? But this is more an intrinsic look, as I understand it, at the Paris Agreement itself and the ratcheting up mechanism, and why we might not be so lucky. So some of the people went away from Paris thinking, wow, we got a number of issues here nailed. That is zero emissions in the future. Some others said, no, these long-term fluffy targets, they are not the real meat. What is the real meat? What we really got in Paris is the ratcheting up mechanism. Every 5 years, you have to increase your ambition. That is the best ever, because that will create the dynamism. Maybe Luke tells us it's just dynamite that will explode and shrapnel flying everywhere, and we are not going to see, and we are not going to think back to the Paris Agreement when we meet here again in 20 years' time. But for those of us who still believe that the Paris Agreement is a major milestone and will lead over the long term to success, we are going to try to prove Luke wrong. So please be attentive to his talk, and then we have a good discussion of trying to poke holes in his arguments. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Lovely. Thank you, Malta. Explosive. Yeah. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the high expectations. Explosive, shrapnel. I'll try to be provocative, but hopefully not too explosive. We'll see. So, as Malta said, I'll be mainly providing a kind of critique of the Paris Agreement. But because we're approaching Christmas, I'll also be putting a nice little kind of optimistic spin at the end of how to make it work. Okay, so to begin with, we're just going to do some basic context, basic but necessary context on what exactly the Paris Agreement is. So first of all, it's worth reflecting on some of the contradictions and the media coverage of the Paris Agreement. So on the one hand, you had The Guardian talking about how nearly 200 nations signing the end of the fossil fuel era. We had Time talking about the historic Paris Agreement. But on the other hand, we had a lot of pessimism. We had James Hansen, very famous climatologist, labeling it as a fraud, really, a fake. We had the likes of Greenpeace and many others coming out and essentially damning it as a suicide pact. So what is it? Is it a historic agreement that will essentially limit our global warming to 2 degrees Celsius and will save us? Or is it just some kind of a diplomatic mirage, a trophy agreement? So just out of interest, quick show of hands, who thinks that Paris will be the primary factor that leads to the world limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or less? So in other words, the Paris will be a success. Oh, Malta is so optimistic. Okay, not bad. And all those who do not think it'll be a success, that it will fail. Okay, it's about even. There's definitely some fence sitters there. So hopefully you'll come around to my way of thinking by the end, but we'll see. So the way that Paris is structured is essentially a global show and tell. The idea is that countries put forward NDCs, which is essentially diplomatic speak for pledges. They put forward pledges on how much they're going to reduce emissions, how much financing they provide, what they're going to do in terms of adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. But the key thing is they put forward these pledges every 5 years, and the world joins together and reviews those pledges in aggregate every 5 years as well. Key things. First of all, it doesn't really come into effect until 2020. You may have heard that it is already entered into force. It's basically legalese for saying that it now is legally binding. But the process doesn't really start until 2020. So in 2020, we have a round of new submissions. 2023 is the first global stocktake. Then it happens every 5 years thereafter. Rolling 5 years, new submissions, and a new stocktake. It's basically it. One big global show and tell. The second key point is it doesn't actually entail many additional legal obligations. So when you look at international treaties, the key thing we talk about is legal obligations, what it requires countries to actually do. So this is a quick little table I made when I was giving a quick little brief to the Senate on whether they should ratify Paris or not. And the key thing I told the Senate was essentially that there's really no reason not to ratify it, since the only additional legal obligation for Australia, the only additional thing we have to do is essentially put forward a new pledge every 5 years. We're not even bound to actually meet that pledge. Yeah, so a key thing there, countries have to put forward a new pledge every 5 years. That's procedural, but they don't actually have to meet it. Is there a compliance mechanism to enforce them meeting it? No. Essentially, if countries don't meet their target, they'll have a chat within the UN about how to do better in the future. It'll be facilitative, not adversarial, but there's no way to actually enforce countries punitively to do better in the future. Most of the other obligations of Paris are either procedural or the things that are already covered on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the overarching treaty. So, key thing, very few legal obligations. The ones that are there are procedural and vague. One thing to keep in mind here is that Paris does not exist in a vacuum. In a way, it's reflective of a much broader trend in international relations. So think back to 2015. It wasn't just Paris people were excited about, it's also the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals agreed to in September of 2015. And a lesser known one was the Corsia Agreement done underneath the International Civil Aviation Authority. Won't go into details, but the key thing is all of these are very, very similar. All of them set long-term global goals, whether it be for temperature, for the amount of aviation emissions, or for, 17 different aspects of the global economy under the SDGs. All of them had close to universal participation. So all of them prioritize making sure to get as many countries on board as is possible. And all of them had quite weak legal form and made the use of pledges. So Paris is technically a treaty under international law, but there's a lot of discussion about, is it legally binding? Because it is a treaty, but as mentioned, it has very, very few legal obligations. So it doesn't actually require states to change their behavior very much. SDGs, on the other hand, that's not a legal treaty, and it has even weaker obligations. Altogether, this shows a kind of shift towards what's called pledge and review systems, where countries put forward pledges of actions that they're going to take. It's reviewed into the future and hopes that those actions will scale up into the future. Key thing, right now, as you all know, we're not on track to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below. Best case scenario is somewhere between 2.4 to 2.7. That's if the pledges and the NDCs are met. It's probably quite an optimistic scenario at this stage because most of this modeling doesn't take into account tipping points and non-linear feedbacks in the climate system. And of course, keep this in mind that it depends upon how you time your emissions reductions. So to have a 66% chance of reaching 1.5 degrees and limiting warming to that level, we essentially only have 6 years of current emissions levels. So 2 things I want to quickly talk about. First of all is it's a bit of a straw man to talk about Paris right now in a static sense, that it's weak right now, the pledges don't add up, etc., etc. You really have to think of it over time. And that's where my critique is going to focus as well. Because the big thing, as Malte talked about, is this logic of ratcheting it up. That yes, the pledges may not be sufficient right now, but Paris has ways of increasing ambition over time. So that's how my critique is going to be focused, is looking at Paris as a system for increasing action over time. But before we do that, I want to quickly talk about a relatively important issue in international relations that I think we often don't give enough credence to. I call it the strawberry problem because of a Simpsons video, which will hopefully turn up now. Have a way. Here we go. Okay, so a bit of context. First of all, who knows the Simpsons? Oh, thank God for that. That was dodged the bullet. Okay, so this is a very famous episode where Mr. Burns, the local billionaire who owns the nuclear power plant, decides to hire a professional baseball team so he can win the local competition. This man you see here is Darryl Strawberry, who is a baseball Hall of Famer. And keep in mind, he's playing against a bunch of local drunks. Okay, so a quick video. Do we have volume?
Real skill.
Perfect. Let's turn back a tad.
Monty, it's up to your managerial skills. What to do? Smithers, massage my brain.
Yes, sir.
You, Strawberry, hit a home run.
Okay, Skip.
I told him to do that.
Brilliant strategy, sir.
All right.
Okay, you're probably wondering, why the hell did I show that? Relevance, Your Honor? Okay, now just briefly, do you think that Darryl Strawberry would have hit that home run regardless of what Mr. Burns said? Yeah, it wasn't the fact that Mr. Burns said, hey, Darryl's hit a home run. So that's the problem of what we call counterfactual, that we don't have a counterfactual well when Mr. Burns didn't say that to measure against. And this is actually a very big problem when it comes to international treaties. It's sometimes difficult to tell what was going to happen anyway and what is the actual impact of an international treaty. So I'll touch upon this a bit more going into the critique, but I think a lot of the impacts people are attributing to Paris. So China is rolling back its coal mines, for example, due to Paris, maybe due to other effects that we aren't taking into account. It's a kind of counterfactual problem, or a strawberry problem, as I call it. So try to keep that in mind, things that were going to happen anyway and things that are actually caused by Paris. Okay, so first of all, what is the logic of Paris? So I think there's two main logics that I hear most people talking about. And the first one is this notion of ambition cycles, that by having these 5-year pledge and review system, basically it creates a logic or a pressure for countries to increase their action over time. And that's for a few different reasons. One is the global stocktake system. So by having a big review every 5 years, that creates a lot of political pressure. It creates a point for NGOs and others to scale up their own action and to put pressure upon governments. And that'll hopefully result in governments either meeting their pledges or putting forward stronger ones in the future. The second one is something you may not have heard about, called a transparency framework, which is basically a way of ensuring that countries are doing what they say they're going to do. And the third one is a ratchet mechanism, which Malta talked about. So that's actually Article 4.3 underneath the Paris Agreement, which we'll talk about very, very soon. So all of these together are essentially supposed to create some kind of really strong impetus for political pressure. The second one that I've heard quite a lot about is the investment signal, that Paris sends out this message to the market. It tells investors that you shouldn't invest in coal-fired power stations or mines because they're a dead end. That if you're going to meet 2 degrees Celsius, those investments will become stranded. It also tells us that if we're going to meet 2 degrees, you have to invest heavily into solar, wind, renewable energies, basically. So it sends a signal to the market and to investors to shift towards low carbon investments. So I'm going to pick both of these apart using systems thinking or systems dynamics. So first of all, there is really no ratchet. So that ratchet mechanism, Article 4.3 right here, essentially says that each party will put forward a pledge that will be a progression beyond previous pledge. Any problems here you can see? Well, the key thing is it's overly vague. So progression, right there, is not defined. And so arguably a country could put forward a pledge that is weaker in terms of mitigation, in terms of how many emissions they reduce, but is stronger in terms of finance. And that could arguably, legally, be justified as progression. So imagine Australia putting forward a pledge that was identical to their previous one, but with an extra dollar of climate finance. I mean, legally speaking, it's a progression. Is it actually what we're looking for? Not even close. The second thing is that due to that vagary, it also means that countries could put forward very, very small progressions. So right now, Australia's target is what, 26 to 28% by 2030? For the next target they could put forward, we're going to do 31% by 2035. So it's actually a decrease significantly on the rate of emissions reductions, but it's technically progression in absolute terms. So there's a lot of loopholes to work through if you wanted to. And secondly, it actually could create a kind of perverse outcome. Why? Well, if you have to put forward stronger pledges in the future, then there's a kind of incentive to put forward weak pledges to begin with, because that way it's much easier to do so in the future. And so think about that when you see articles talking about how China and India are already overachieving on their NDCs. It's largely because they put forward incredibly weak NDCs in the future. I mean, China, for example, talks about how it wants to peak emissions by 2030 under its pledge. And yet, when you actually look at its emissions, it's probably going to peak them anyway by 2025 or earlier. So they're intentionally putting forward an overly weak pledge. So whatever they do looks quite good by comparison. So there is no ratchet mechanism. And there also, I don't think, is any transparency framework, insofar as no one actually knows about the transparency framework. So going back to those logics, we can cross out both the transparency framework and we can cross out the ratchet mechanism, which leaves us basically with the global stocktake, the ambition cycles, and the investment signal. So hopefully this shouldn't scare you too much. This is just a really basic systems diagram. Anyone worked one of these before? Any engineers in the room? Cool. So very, very simple. These essentially are variables. The arrows show a connection of influence, and these polarities, these little pluses and minuses, essentially show the relationship. And all it means if you have a negative is that the change in one is the same kind of, sorry, it's a different kind of change than the change of the other. A plus means that the rate of change is the same. So if you have an increase in the progress towards meeting global goals, you'll have an increase in regulatory certainty because of the plus. Vice versa, if you have an increase in progress, there'll be less pressure from the review process. So what this is supposed to show is essentially how the logic of Paris is a logic of feedbacks. Yeah? So when we progress towards meeting global goals, it creates more regulatory certainty that we're heading towards a low carbon transformation. And what does that do? It drives even further progress. As we keep on getting better and better, it creates even more certainty that countries are going to meet their pledges, and it feeds back into the system. So I think this is essentially the investment signal that people are expecting. And this is essentially the political pressure system that people are expecting. That if we're not making good progress towards our global goals, if we're way off, if we're heading towards 3 or 4 degrees, well, there's more pressure from the review process. And that will hopefully help us change track. Yeah. So on the one hand, we have a balancing feedback from the political pressure and a reinforcing feedback from the investment signal. Cool. Any questions? Yep, I'm back.
How effective do you think the investment signal is, given that much of the soft diplomacy is carried on through a country's foreign policy?
Yeah, I'll be getting to that. Basically, I think there's a whole bunch of reasons to doubt the investment signal doesn't exist. And I think that's actually a very good one, is that there's higher priorities for most countries, whether it's foreign affairs or geopolitics. But we'll get into that a bit more in depth later. So first of all, I want to pick apart the political pressure argument. So this is the idea that by having these 5-year cycles, it creates a pressure from below, through NGOs and through the public, or it creates a kind of peer pressure between countries. So reputational peer pressure is a key issue. But the thing is, when you look at it empirically, peer pressure hasn't had a very good track record in terms of international agreements. So who can think of an international agreement which actually relied upon that kind of peer pressure? Kyoto to an extent. I mean, most people would argue that Kyoto, because it had a compliance mechanism, because countries could essentially get fined if they didn't meet their targets, it was a bit more advanced beyond that. Yeah, so it's kind of like almost a rolling fine system in a certain way, insofar as it had to take a larger burden going into the future. And the key ones we usually think about are the 1975 Helsinki Accords, the Geneva Conventions. There was something called the Tuberculosis Framework, and there's also a bunch of environmental ones called the Ramsar Convention, amongst others. The key thing is none of these have been really overly successful. I mean, the Geneva Convention, of course, did in many ways provide a bedrock for international law, but we have violations of the Geneva Convention essentially every year. Tuberculosis framework, well, we don't have any tuberculosis anymore. That's mainly because countries already had a very, very large incentive to wipe out tuberculosis because the people were dying from it. Now think about all the most successful agreements you've heard of. Montreal. Yep, Montreal Protocol, World Trade Organization perhaps. All of those ones required and relied upon heavy material incentives and disincentives. If you weren't part of the Montreal Protocol, you couldn't trade with other countries who were part of it in ozone-depleting substances. So drawing an analogous example, that would be like saying if you're not part of Paris, you can't trade in fossil fuels with those who are. World Trade Organization, of course, has the ability to potentially trade embargo countries. Yep. So when we actually really care about changing state behavior, we don't rely upon peer pressure. We rely upon really heavy sticks and carrots. So empirically, peer pressure doesn't have much success. It can work when it comes to academia, but that's not a process that I'd recommend. And there's a second reason to really doubt that the peer pressure mechanism will work. So as mentioned, it doesn't have a good track record. Empirically, there's no reason to believe it will work. But also on top of that is that in order to have an effective review mechanism which actually creates a lot of pressure, it has to be very stringent. Yeah? So the pressure system relies upon how effective and stringent your review process is. And the global stocktake right now is far from being stringent or from providing a close level of scrutiny. It doesn't even require that individual countries are reviewed. All it does is look in aggregate at what countries are doing as a collective. Yeah, so this is a snapshot of every single country altogether, how we're projecting into the future against 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. It does not provide individual critical review of each country. So do you think Australia is really going to get a lot of peer pressure based upon that kind of global stocktake? So if we're not heading towards 2 degrees Celsius, do you think everyone's really going to point their fingers towards Australia? Probably not. Each country is going to point towards everyone else, and it's going to really provide just a diffuse loss of responsibility. No country in particular is going to get singled out, and thus there'll be no real peer pressure. So 2 reasons to doubt that the peer pressure system is going to work. First of all, it lacks a good track record. And secondly, it's not built to work. It's not designed to actually be effective. And there's a third reason. It's quite simple. It's because we've already been doing pledge and review for the last 2 decades. So when you look at the way the climate negotiations played out, realistically, we've already been doing a pledge and review system every 5 years for quite some time now. So the pledging started back in 1988 at the Toronto conference. There you go. At the Toronto conference, we had a number of countries, Luxembourg, Austria, Denmark, all the good European citizens. They put forward a pledge to reduce their emissions by, what was it, 5% from 1988 levels by 2000. None of them met those pledges. Thereafter, we had the 1992 UNFCCC established. We had the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which entered into force in 2005. We had the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, widely remembered as a failure. But keep in mind, prior to Copenhagen, we had a round of Copenhagen pledges, which got over 130 countries to put forward pledges. So Paris wasn't really that historic in terms of getting a lot of countries to put forward pledges. Copenhagen already did that. We had those pledges formalized under the Cancun Accords. Then we decided the pledging system anew in 2015. So think about a country like, or a group of countries in this case, like the European Union. They had targets under the Kyoto Protocol, which started in 2005. They then put forward a new pledge in 2009 and a new pledge in 2015, roughly every 5 years. At the same time, we had the IPCC. What was it, 2001, 2007, roughly every 5 years, releasing an assessment report. And that report included a global stocktake, essentially. It included a projection of how countries are going right now in relation to global goals. On top of that, you also had Climate Action Tracker, Climate Analytics, numerous different groups which look at how individual countries are tracking against their goals. So we've already had numerous formal and non-formal review systems, and we've already had pledging happening for a very long time. Has this been effective? Well, if you look at global emissions, probably not. And if you look at individual case studies, probably not as well. In 2013, after both its Copenhagen Pledge and a target under the Kyoto Protocol, Australia abolished its carbon pricing system, which had been effective up until that point. There was international outcry, there was a lot of pressure. Did it change what Tony Abbott and Co. did domestically? No, they really couldn't care less. Canada didn't meet its target under Kyoto and simply withdrew. Once again, a lot of peer pressure, a lot of outcry. Did it change what Canada was doing domestically? No, not really. So based upon both the system, based upon the track record of peer pressure, and based upon the history of the climate negotiations, there's good reasons to believe that the peer pressure system won't work. Next up, we have the investment signal. So don't let your eyes glaze over too much. All I'm basically saying with this is that when you have a lot of trust in these long-term goals, so we trust that the international community is going to meet 2 degrees or 1.5, then what does that do? It creates a lot of regulatory certainty. It creates a lot of certainty that we're heading towards a low carbon future. And what does that do? Well, it deters investments in emissions intensive activities. So it deters an investment in a coal-fired power station or a coal mine, for example, but it also facilitates investments towards low emissions technologies, towards solar, wind, etc. Pretty simple. So if you want to know if that investment signal is working, the 2 things you look at is renewable energy investment and the investment in coal or otherwise emissions intensive infrastructure. So first of all, renewables. This is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance and essentially provides a year-by-year breakdown of investments in major renewables, solar PV, wind, etc., etc. As you can see, it's a pretty feel-good story. Went from 46.6 billion from 2004 all the way up to 285.9 in 2015. Now, does this really track very well against international climate policy? I mean, think in 2009, for example, we had the Copenhagen failure. That was catastrophic, right? Everyone was absolutely distraught that the negotiations collapsed and we didn't get a global deal. And yet, between 2009 and 2010, we actually had one of the largest, and 2011 as well, one of the largest increases in renewable energy investment. In 2005, it's probably the closest thing we can see to a signal of sorts. In 2005, we had the largest increase percentage-wise across this graph between 2005 and 2006. And that's when the Kyoto Protocol came into effect and the EU emissions trading scheme came into force as well. But overall, when you actually track across this, including if I had 2016 here, it would actually be a dip in investment. 2016 was down from 2015. It doesn't really track well against international climate policy. We don't see a very clear boom and bust cycle based upon what's happening in the negotiations. And there's a lot of problems with this course, and one of them is that there's a lag when you have a large-scale investment. There's also other factors like the increase after 2009 could be the recovery from the global financial crisis, for example. But the key thing is that people who are talking about the investment signal don't have a lot of empirical evidence. The burden of proof should be to show that historically there's been an investment signal sent from negotiations and from international outcomes which has shaped the market forces. And we simply don't see that. Now, let's think about the second aspect, emissions-intensive infrastructure. Do you think that the Paris Agreement has been successful in deterring investors from going towards coal mines, coal generators, any kind of emissions-intensive activity? What do you think? Anyone brave? Adani? So is that a case study of showing that it has or has not? Yeah, so we have the Australian government offering to subsidise Adani. Yeah.
Paris has been very successful in saying to industry to an actual fact look after its own energy intensive requirements and invest in technology. I think that's probably the legacy of our last Paris.
Mm-hmm.
The previous one.
Yeah. Any further thoughts?
There's a few smaller signals, things like the Newcastle Port Authority announcement today.
Yep.
So there's smaller signals,
yep,
but not necessarily the large scale. And I imagine you have a slide with empirical evidence, so I'm not going to go the other way right now.
Actually, I don't have a slide of empirical evidence, so you're okay in this case. Talk freely.
Anecdotally, a few smaller cases, but I'm not aware of any big.
Yeah, so it's kind of mixed. We have, for example, the Financial Stability Board, which has a large impact on multilateral development banks, and they've put out guidelines on carbon risk exposure, for example. We have Adani's, a little bit of both, insofar as the Australian government's trying to push as hard as possible to subsidise it and get it on board, but a lot of banks are also dropping out. You also have, China, for example, has actually restricted its coal supply drastically on the domestic stage, but it's also funding one of the largest coal-fired power station complexes in Pakistan, which I think is worth over 300 billion or something. We still have at this stage, I think, over 1,000 coal-fired generators in the pipeline over the next 5 years. And it's hard to tell how much of this is due to Paris. So Adani, for example, banks dropping out, is that due to Paris or is that due to the very large NGO campaign against it? Hard to tell. The Financial Stability Board, is that due to Paris or is it due to the fact that carbon exposure is a major problem that was already being talked about prior to Paris? So this is a kind of strawberry problem. It's very easy when anything goes right to point towards Paris and say, yes, it's because we have these global goals. It's much more difficult to actually think critically about whether Paris was the driving factor. At this stage, I think the jury is out in terms of whether Paris is having a really strong impact upon deterring investment in coal and other forms of fossil fuel infrastructure. But I don't think it looks good in any case. Yep, Ruben?
Yes, so I think...
Not Ruben, Ken.
I think with a very convincing case of Paris not being the driving factor.
Yeah.
Do you think Paris is the organizing factor?
Yeah, so does it provide a kind of framework to perhaps channel these signals through it? It's hard to tell. I think potentially, but once again, it's hard to say whether that umbrella is necessary. If all these little anyway factors are going to happen, these little signals are going to happen anyway, do you require a big umbrella to actually channel them in any way? Yep.
I don't think it's so much Paris. You keep talking about Paris as if it's some sort of club med situation. There's a lot of side measures going on.
Yeah.
Part of this conventional, if you like.
Mm.
And if you, in actual fact, attended the bankers and the finance international investors convention, it was very clear what they were talking about. And that is their risk assessment with regards to future stranded assets, and where in actual fact they should be putting their money, regardless of regulatory certainty within a country, is very clear.
Yeah.
And that was really one of the big takeaways from the last Paris round. But finally, bankers, investors, institutions came on board and said, look, we have to divest. We have to put our money, not because we necessarily want it, but it's our money, or at least the money that we're putting trust for to look after.
Yes, I mean, there's good signs like with the World Bank, for example, last week at the One Planet Summit, talking about how they're going to end new investments, or new loans, I should say, towards gas as well as oil after 2019. But once again, across all of this, it's really difficult to say whether bankers were driven by Paris. I mean, of course, they're going to say verbally, yes, we were, because it's good corporate social responsibility. You want to link it up to international law. It's a feel-good story. You're not going to say we're doing it because renewables is becoming really, really cheap and because it's a dumb move in general. So it's really hard to disassociate how much of an impact Paris has had. And of course, despite all the talk about this major low carbon shift, we haven't really seen a tsunami in terms of changing investment patterns. Otherwise, that would have turned up in this. And as mentioned, 2016 and 2017 are actually a dip from 2015. The few empirical studies we have around the market message are from the trade regime. So this is really an understudied area. We don't really know what impact international law has upon investors and upon international markets. We know from looking at things like the World Trade Organization and investment settlement dispute mechanisms that it seems to have an impact, but only when it changes domestic law in individual countries. So if you look at the WTO and investor state dispute settlement mechanisms, it tends to be when international law changes what individual governments are doing, that can then have an impact on investors. So it's really about the strength of domestic policies rather than about just having these long-term goals in the first place. So if you are an investor in Australia, are you really going to care as much about Paris or about Australia's individual NDC and our current policies? It's probably overwhelmingly going to be the latter rather than the former. And across all of this, it's important to keep in mind is that the system isn't really just about those individual mechanisms. It's about a timeline. The fourth dimension of sustainable development is time. I have little doubt that given enough time, we would reach a low carbon or zero carbon world. But unfortunately, there's a very, very short deadline we have to work to. And the key problem for me with Paris is that it does not respect that deadline remotely. So the key thing is that Paris doesn't start until 2020. Countries aren't required to put forward new pledges, well, some of them 2020 and most of them 2025. The first global stock take is not until 2023. By that stage, you're basically screwed, to put it simply. Here is an article from a bunch of researchers at Oxford talking about the infrastructure for a 2-degree world. Even under the very optimistic assumption that other sectors reduce emissions in line with a 2-degree target, no new emitting electricity infrastructure can be built after 2017 for this target to be met. So this is from the abstract. What it basically means is that in order to stick to 2 degrees Celsius, we can't have any new coal, oil, or gas generators after this year. Anything that is built after this year, I'm not mistaken, this year ends in a couple of days realistically, anything built has to be prematurely retired. It has to become a stranded asset. And as mentioned, we already still have over 1,000 at least coal-fired generators in the pipeline, not to mention even more in terms of gas and oil. And when you look at IPCC scenarios, the key thing across most of them is they require some kind of peak, usually before 2020. And most of these, even though they peak around or before 2020, then rely upon the idea of negative emissions. So a state where we're actually drawing more carbon out of the atmosphere or more greenhouse gases than we're emitting. It's not just zero net emissions, but an actual state where we're resulting in negative emissions over time. And of course, that's untested technology at this stage. So the delay that Paris has embedded into its system essentially means that it's already borderline useless when it comes to meeting our global challenges. Unless, of course, negative emissions technologies end up becoming some kind of deus machina, a miracle technology which gets us out of this mess. But for now, the way that Paris is structured over time is going to be inadequate to actually break that deadlock, and will be locked into a high intensity, high emissions intense scenario by 2020. I just want to quickly address this one, since it's a retort I often hear from my students, and that is pretty simple, and to me overwhelmingly simple, is that Paris is still better than nothing. That it's better than the alternative of having a collapse at the negotiations. Maybe. I mean, I think one of the problems is that when you build an international treaty, it's like building a power station. It gets locked in over time. So Paris is something we're going to have to rely upon for the next couple of decades. If we had have waited until better political dynamics, we may have been able to get something much, much stronger. And there's a second problem. This is an article in Nature Climate Change that came out a couple of months ago, which talks about the appeasement effect. So they actually did a large number of surveys throughout Germany, and essentially found that the German public was aware of what happened at Paris at a very simple basis. But from the coverage from those who knew about international climate policy, they were less likely to support a strong role for Germany to play in international policy, and were less likely to take individual action. Why? Because they looked to the international stage and said, well, we have this big international treaty, it's taking care of things. There's no reason for the German government to show leadership, and there's no reason for me to take personal sacrifice, because things are already happening internationally. So there's a potential danger here as well when it comes to international treaties, that trophy agreements that look good in practice, or look good in theory, I should say, can just appease people and provide less political pressure, if anything. So very briefly, how to improve it. I'll admit these are half-baked ideas, since it's my attempt to try to provide an optimistic spin on things. But I think, generally speaking, by understanding the realistic weaknesses of Paris, it provides you with a pretty strong platform for trying to think about ways to leverage improvement. So first of all, Paris Rulebook. So this is the details and the provisions of the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to come out next year. So right now, Paris is a skeleton, and most of the rules still need to be developed. They will be developed and adopted next year. I think the two key things you have to make sure when looking at the rulebook, first of all, is make sure the stock take is political. It's not just a technical detailing of how emissions are going, but it actually does, to the greatest extent possible, try to bring together ministers and try to get a lot of media coverage. If you want to send a political message, you have to make sure there's actual media coverage and political attention in the first place. And secondly is make sure that pledges are no longer a Wild West scenario, that you can't just put forward any baseline you want and any target you want, that there's some very clear commonalities so countries can actually compare very easily what they're doing. So right now we have countries using a range of baselines from 2000, 2005, 1990. That makes it very difficult for both people, but also for governments sometimes to really easily compare and contrast and to provide any pressure. So those are two key ones. Oops. Go back. There we go. Secondly, you have to fill the gaps left by Paris. So first of all, look towards having plurilateral deals, having small clubs, whether it's Club Med or Men's Gentlemen clubs going forward. There we go, Club Med will do. So basically having small groups who have stronger rules together and can take more progressive, ambitious action. So think of it as kind of critical masses that are moving underneath the framework and umbrella of Paris. Probably goes without saying, but you need to have carbon pricing. I won't go too in depth, but there's ways of reaching that. I've done some research for the World Bank on that. And you need to look increasingly towards supply side measures. So as mentioned, we still have over 1,000 qualified generators in the works. We also have continued exploration for new coal, gas, and oil. That's all going to be stranded if you have to meet 2 or 1.5 degrees. So you have to immediately stop searching for new fossil fuel investments.
I would add one more. Instead of looking at supply side, which is the reason why Australia is in the mess it is in, because that's what we've continuously done. Look at demand-side measures?
I think there's a little bit need for both, realistically. And last but not least, make sure you're insured against likely scenarios in the future. So as mentioned, the way the Paris is structured, it almost certainly locks us into a need for both negative emissions technologies, but also some kind of a way to deal with stranded assets. So first of all, when it comes to negative emissions technologies, they're not going to develop themselves. If you want to have technologies developed, you have to have clear governance mechanisms around them, and you have to have early investment. Solar took over 4 decades to really drop significantly in price. And likewise, in negative emissions technologies, you want to get started early, so when we have to turn towards them in 2030, 2040, 2050, they're already cheap and easily deployed. And stranded assets goes without saying, but we need to really start thinking about a problem before it occurs. This is a quick bit of work that Frank Yotson and I did, looking at how many, the level of reserves of unburnable carbon Australia will have under a 2-degree scenario. And so essentially, unburnable coal in Australia is roughly somewhere between 92 to 96%. Yeah, so 92 to 96% of coal in Australia cannot be dug up and burnt. Now, I'm pretty certain that's not going to be respected. I'm pretty certain over 4 to 8% of coal reserves are going to be dug up and burned over the next few years. So we need to start to really think about, if we are going to strand assets, what does that mean politically? Because the closest scenario we've had to that was the global financial crisis, when we had one industry go completely under and the government had to either bail it out, or in the case of Iceland, had to undergo a revolution. So thinking similarly, when it comes to stranded assets, are we going to bail out the fossil fuel companies, or is it going to take something more drastic? Either way, they're two very big problems that we need to start thinking about early, and we need to start thinking about often. So that's basically it. That's, I think, hopefully a pretty persuasive argument as to why you cannot rely upon Paris, why it will probably fail. But it hopefully also provides a realistic depiction of what Paris is, and therefore a helpful way of thinking about how can it be improved. And hopefully didn't come across just like this, but as something a bit more helpful and constructive. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. And now for the discussion, we have microphones going around. Please use them. I make a humble start. Where to start? You put up a straw man of Paris should solve everything. But Paris, the international negotiations, that's only one necessary framework where the real meat has to happen is the national policy, the local policy. Does that international framework support more advanced, more progressive national and local policies? Absolutely. It creates the space of the world is moving forward. If you're not, then you're left behind, and you don't move with the general wisdom of the journey is going to zero emissions, and this is what our overall target is. So I think, from my reading, you expect too much from an international treaty. The international treaty is only one layer of multiple layers that have to happen, and the international level has now fulfilled what it has to fulfill in basic schemes. But all your medication for how to save it or how to not turn it into a failure, I would say, yes, absolutely. They are all necessary, but they are amendments to what happened now in the international arena. So the number of issues, you said we have violations every year. Well, international agreements, of course, you're going to have violations. We don't have a world government. So any country like Canada or anybody else could walk out. Trump is doing so from the Paris Agreement in 3 or 4 years' time. But you can't prevent that from happening. So that is not necessarily a measure of success. The year-by-year investment that you showed, if you would multiply it by how dramatically the costs have fallen, the actual investment in terms of megawatt hours, they continue to skyrocket. So it's kind of a success story as well in there in that graph that yes, even if the dollar investments dropped, the actual megawatts investments were significantly coming up higher. Do I have other points here?
Well, that's already three I think I can deal with. So, okay, so the first one, what do we expect from international treaty? I mean, I agree completely. It's only one aspect of the problem. But the key thing is when you think about international agreements, what are they there for? They're not there to really create change. They're usually there to codify existing norms and to reinforce change. The key point of this is Paris adequate? Does it drive enough change? So yes, it does, of course, send a signal that the world is moving forward, et cetera, et cetera. But the big question is that enough? And I think the key point of the presentation is that it probably isn't. And when we think about international agreements, and we think about how does it create that lower level change, that change at the local level, at the national level, once again, all the successful ones usually have much stronger material incentives and disincentives. World Trade Organization, Montreal Protocol, et cetera, et cetera. When you want to create change at a lower level, when you want to have an overarching framework which facilitates change, you don't just rely upon vague, lofty goals and rely upon having a lot of people involved, but a lot of countries agreeing. We literally don't have any examples of treaties working that way. There's no single international treaty or regime you can point towards which worked purely because it had a broad and shallow structure. Quite to the opposite extent, they all usually start small. Montreal only had 42 countries, but have really strong rules. So I don't think it's really a straw man argument per se. I was never saying that Paris is a silver bullet or has to be a silver bullet. It just simply, does it provide enough to change dynamics at a national and local level? Okay, second one was violations of international law. Yep, of course, but there's differences in frequency. The amount that the Geneva Convention is violated is very, very large in comparison to WTO. Why? Because Geneva Convention, there's essentially no recourse if countries violate it. World Trade Organization, you can get your ass trade embargoed. No one wants to mess with that. So yes, there's a straw man that international law, because there's a lack of global government, cannot have any impact. But in practice, countries often follow international law because they're afraid of material incentives and disincentives. And last of all, I agree, when you factor in the cost of renewable energy, it is a feel-good story. But once again, it's a strawberry factor. It was going to happen anyway. The drop in solar price has happened irrespective of what's been happening realistically in international negotiations. The only time, okay, actually, I don't have it on me, but if you bring up a graph, the only time we've actually seen a clear track between the drop in price and international policy outcomes was 2005, the implementation of the European Trading Scheme. And that was because it actually was a very, very clear regulatory framework across national governments. It wasn't due to Kyoto Protocol per se. So I agree, but that doesn't really matter. It doesn't actually show that international law has a big impact upon investments and markets. We'll continue.
Brief response, chair's prerogative.
Yep. Go ahead.
The success of the investment cycles, yes, of course. Again, you have to have national policies in place to drive the cost down. And in much of the renewable story, that was triggered by feed-in tariffs in Germany, that was triggered by maybe early expectations of the emission trading system in Europe, etc. But these needed to have a background of the international agreement. Yes, the world is moving ahead. What was now at stake for the international agreement was, is the story there that the world is moving ahead, or do we have unfair competition from the likes China or India, etc.? That was a dominating roadblock in moving ahead. And look at what Paris changed. Now Trump, world's #1 superpower, wants to say, cancel the Paris Agreement, and the world stands united. No, you're the only one out. Even Syria now joined the Paris Agreement. And that narrative, that is an unparalleled success of international negotiation. I agree with you that we have to look further into and the French did that in the run-up to Paris, whether that is a step that is already possible, border tax adjustment, and more the punitive measures of how to make it stick and how to be part of a club that moves forward. But these are the next steps. I think Paris achieved a lot, and the Trump withdrawal was the litmus test of whether Paris was successful in this evolutionary step. Anyway, I exhausted my chair's prerogative. Questions, and you had your, so we start here with Dimitri, and then we go here.
It's slightly related to what Kenny was bringing up, is whether treaties like this or agreements like this actually have the effect prior to coming into effect. So because you have this on the horizon, that countries come together and get to a plan even before the agreement has been signed.
Yes, when you look at the history of international agreements, it is a little from column A, a little from column B, but I think column B is far more powerful. So look at Montreal Protocol, for example. The US and others were already putting in place domestic regulations to help monitor and reduce ozone-depleting substances, but it scaled massively afterwards. Yep. So the rules, the material incentives and incentives provided by Montreal drastically changed what countries are doing. And so, yes, you can argue that these summits provide a nice meeting point and an opportunity for countries to put forward pledges and to showcase what they're doing. But is it enough? Usually not. I'll use just a very quick prerogative to quickly respond to Malta, just very, very briefly. So when you think about international agreements, you can think about them broad and shallow, so having a lot of countries but very weak rules, or deep and narrow. You have less countries, and it makes it easier to have harder rules. I'd say Kyoto was actually closer to the latter. It was more deep and narrow. And that's the reason why it was more successful in terms of having Germany and others take leadership roles and drive solar energy down. I mean, once again, you look at it historically, every single successful international treaty, there's no example of broad and shallow. And the reason why solar dropped, yes, was due to German leadership. That was the actions of one country. That's what you need to look towards, is strong action by single countries rather than trying to get everyone on board and drop the rules because you want to have broad participation. So I think that's the key thing, is really just a disagreement on whether you want try to get kind of big trophy agreement with all countries involved, or whether you try to argue and kind of aim towards having smaller groups and critical masses of the willing. And I think so far, arguably, Kyoto was more successful than Paris in that way. Because if you're looking at the drop in renewable energy prices, wind was due to Denmark, solar was largely due to Germany. And the reason why Paris came together was because of those drops in renewable energy technologies and their prices. So moving along. We'll continue in the afternoon. We'll have coffee.
Yeah, look, it's an advantage in it being shallow given the dynamics and the rate of change.
Yep.
It gives voice to small islands
Yep.
In the Pacific. It gives credibility in terms of world order to China over the United States in terms of moral high ground. I think there's some strength in the dynamic to having a shallow form of agreement through that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely benefits, but the big question is, do the benefits outweigh the costs? You know, is it enough to have virtue signaling at the cost of strong rules? And I think it's definitely not the case. I mean, the island states, they had a voice prior to Paris. They had a voice in Kyoto. They've actually had less influence since Kyoto when you look at it. I did my thesis in the honors around small island states. And additionally, I mean, cementing the role of China, that was probably going to happen anyway, because China, what they're doing domestically, and because of their increasing power in international order. And the US has been falling in influence for many, many years. So I think those small benefits in terms of perhaps reinforcing multilateralism or providing some kind of signal of how the world is working, they're there, but they're just weak in comparison to what you can get from an international treaty if it is strong. Yep.
Can you go back to the slide with the policy projections and the baseline?
Can try.
So I agree that it's hard to. I agree that it's hard to relate what is also with IM scenarios. Should go back to the one with climate analytics scenarios with baselines, current policy.
Oh, right, gotcha. This one, yeah.
So I find that comparing the success of the Kyoto Protocol, which was not very ambitious, and comparing that with the success of the Paris Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals, which basically try to solve all of the world's problems. If the metric for success is whether we get to below 1.5 degrees, avoid dangerous impact of global warming, then yes, it will be very difficult to avoid all of that, eradicate poverty and all of this. If the success can be understood as well as avoiding as much as possible of the effects of global warming, well, we do see a sort of a decoupling here from the baselines, between baselines and current policies, between current policies and pledges. And these pledges are meant to increase over time. So it also depends of what you define as a success. And I think part of it is because these agreements are very broad and very ambitious.
So 2 quick things. First of all, is this an anywhere factor? I mean, I think most of the pledges that we'll put forward are going to happen regardless of Paris being there. I mean, the actions China is taking is largely due to air pollution, and they're trying to corner a new emerging market and renewable energy technology. The actions Germany are taking are also not predictated upon Paris, realistically. So I think most of these pledges were going to happen anyway, regardless of Paris. And whether they're met, I don't think largely contends or depends upon Paris either. And in terms of how do we judge success, I agree. It's probably not just a matter of looking at 2 degrees or 1.5 as a kind of line in the sand. It's probably more about looking at how does an international agreement change state behavior. But I think, and this is probably one of the key points of the presentation, is that big, broad, shallow trophies don't really change behavior that much. There's arguments they can through a peer pressure signal or an investment signal, but we have just a lack of empirical evidence and a lack of reason to believe they do so. So yes, we can change the notion of success, but I think the argument still holds. I think that if you want to change state behavior, it's not through this way. It's through smaller and more deep agreements.
I would have thought that Paris was actually a progression of UN committees and international bodies working towards an E-wash-E outcome. That is, we know, what we need to do in order to reduce the impact of man-made climate change. But by doing so, we need to look at E for energy, because we need energy in order to keep our societies running. We need to look at clean water, because much of the Southeast Asia Pacific region is, we need clean drinking water. Otherwise, we have health problems, which of course is the H issue. And then there is sanitation, and the last thing is, of course, education, and the identification by GIZ, organisations like GIZ, REAP, etc., who are very heavily involved with Geneva and a number of private and, of course, government NGOs to invest in these areas. They have been working for years, as part of the Paris Agreement to identify precisely what needs to happen. So, figures such as we need $1.7 billion, trillion dollars, in order to invest into the Asia-Pacific region just to address climate change and infrastructure needs. I mean, that didn't exist before Paris. That was a number that came out, as part of the process. So what we're working on now is how do we actually invest that money appropriately and effectively. That's what Paris is about.
Yeah. So 2 quick responses. One, I agree. As someone who works as a consultant part-time, there's nothing better than consultancies, environmental consultancies, as the Paris Agreement. We have so many more slideshows and reports to do now. So many more, numbers and figures we can chuck out for the investment levels needed. But that being said, we actually did already have estimates of how much 2 degrees would cost, how much 1.5 degrees would cost, the levels of investments needed prior to Paris. Because all Paris did was simply enshrine legally the 2 degree target, which you already had from Copenhagen and Cancun. And the fact that it's good for consultants and good for projecting numbers that are needed isn't necessarily a good thing. I mean, most consultants' works get disregarded by national governments. So having those numbers is kind of useless if it doesn't actually result in change.
Thank you. In the interest of time, and also because now this somewhat degraded into a bit of a male boxing match here, I wouldn't want to take up that challenge, but
I think it's sports actually.
Any questions from the other half of humanity?
Thanks, Malte. Thanks, Luke. I'm really only asking a question because you wanted a woman to ask a question. So I have a question about, although you keep talking about, Luke, about the treaties needing to change state behaviour,
yeah,
a lot of what you've talked about has been about investment, and a lot of that is not state-based.
True.
So on your slides where you're talking about investment and your feed forward and feedback loops with investment in either emissions intensive or less emissions intensive, I think there's an important mediating factor in there, which you have referred to, but not in that context, is cost. So as the cost of renewables are coming down, the unit costs of renewables, investment doesn't really reflect deployment. It reflects how much is sort of needed in that space at that time, and where there is available. And there's lots of different sort of constraining factors in there. So I wonder if, A, whether that's a good proxy for measuring that investment appetite. And my other comment, which is sort of around that, is I think feeding off what we were just saying, which is that perhaps the pledges in the Paris Agreement are less about ambition and saying where nation states can go in the next 5 years, and more about a way to consolidate or a way to announce where we think we're at in terms of capacity. So looking at costs and looking at the appetite from subnational actors, this is where we think we can get within the next 5 years. If all those things change in the next 5 years, we'll ratchet that down. So it's less about where we can get as more of a reflection of where we think we're at.
Yeah, they're both good comments. I'm glad to hear you found it interesting enough that you wouldn't have asked otherwise. So in terms of renewable energy, I agree completely. And what I plan on doing in the future before releasing this article is actually trying to get really concrete costs and then cross-referencing that against investments. And the key thing is, once again, this is the best data we have. And it's not about, is renewable energy investment increasing over time? Because it should be, right? It's about, does that track against international climate policy outcomes? And I think even if you include the price, it really doesn't. It's once again about what's happening domestically, the fall feed-in tariffs in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. It's not about this big signal coming from international markets. And ultimately, I mean, the onus should not be upon me to provide evidence that the investment signal doesn't work. The onus of proof should be upon those who actually think an investment signal does exist, because right now there's no theoretical or empirical evidence that it does. And it's kind of, for me, risky to base an entire international architecture upon an idea that has not been empirically tested. In terms of pledges, I agree completely. I think it's more a reflection of capacity and what countries think they're capable of, rather than necessarily where they want to go. But will that help us reach 2 degrees? Probably not. And will countries already do that to some extent anyway? Probably. I mean, Copenhagen pledges were very similar. The Copenhagen pledges really reflect the capacity and what countries thought they were capable of. Do you need to actually sacrifice an entire international architecture to get that? Probably not. You know, we could have had a pledging process that wasn't legally binding, and we could have had that back in the 1990s if we wanted to.
Thank you very much, Luke.
Pleasure,
the way we do it at our retreats when we have debates with all the students is everybody gets a little popsicle stick, or 10 of them. And then you can throw them to the stage when you agree with a comment made, or you can throw them in another corner if you don't agree with it.
Do you throw them to the speaker, or?
Yeah. So I think next time we invite you here, we are going to have 1,000 popsicle sticks.
I look forward to it. Death by popsicle sticks.
Thank you so much. That hopefully gives you food for thought for the summer break, and hope to see you back here in the new year with new seminars and events coming up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Sounds like we'll have to chat more.